Greetings and welcome to Whitewashing Anime Adaptations, Ghost in the Shell and Dragonball Evolution. In this presentation, Dr. David O makes a theoretical argument for whitewashing as an erasure of difference that centers and makes visible white subjectivity. Specifically, he argues that because of contemporary racial politics, Asian and Asian Americans are vulnerable to filmic erasure. He argues that whitewashing is among many strategies of white supremacy and that whitewashing operates by extending whiteness boundaries. For the talk, he focuses on his chapter on anime adaptations, including Dragonball Evolution and Ghost in the Shell, to describe ways Asianness is distorted and minimized in order to subjectify the hero, the white hero. Hi. My name is Keenan Colquitt. I'm the Program Manager for Diversity Scholar Engagement with the National Center for Institutional Diversity, NCID, at the University of Michigan. I facilitate programs, events, and initiatives such as the Diversity Scholars Network that are committed to advancing understandings of historical and contemporary social issues related to identity, difference, culture, representation, power, oppression, and inequality as they occur and affect individuals, groups, communities, and institutions. We are proud to sponsor this event in collaboration with the Anti-Racism Collaborative, University of Michigan Library, Asian Pacific Islander American Studies Program, the Department of Film, Television, and Media, and Digital Studies Institute. On behalf of myself, NCID, and all of our sponsors, we welcome you. We begin this presentation with the land acknowledgement. The University of Michigan is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Three Fires Confederacy made the largest single land transfer to the University of Michigan. This was offered ceremonially through the treaty at the foot of the rapids. Through these words of acknowledgement, their contemporary and ancestral ties to the land and their contributions to the university are renewed and reaffirmed. And now to our event, offered by Dr. David O.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Keenan Colquitt, for the invitation. Thank you to the University of Michigan and the National Center for Institutional Diversity for hosting and allowing me to share my research with everyone. I also want to say to everyone out in Zoom land, thank you for sharing your afternoon with me, and also may the 4th be with you. Before I get started, I want to set a couple of expectations here. So despite the very cool poster, I won't be talking about the legendary anime Ghost in the Shell and Dragon Ball, except as reference points. Instead, I'll be talking about their Hollywood adaptations. So let me first talk about what motivated my interest in whitewashing, my backstory, if you will. I really started to notice and become annoyed by what are arguably whitewashed representations early in my PhD program some 20 years ago. Around the time Kill Bill came out as well, and although it's a much better series of movies than The Last Samurai, it didn't just playfully use East Asian cinematic iconography. The movie centered the Uma Thurman character Beatrix Kiddo in it. She wielded a katana while wearing Bruce Lee's iconic yellow tracksuit that he wore in Game of Death, his last movie. In the first Kill Bill film, she slaughtered the 88 Japanese Yakuza in the Crazy 88, maimed a mixed-race Asian white woman, killed Gogo Yubari, a schoolgirl assassin, and killed their boss, O-Ren. The slaughter of so many disposable Asian bodies to establish the credibility of the white heroine in the movie was, frankly, for me, hard to watch. But I'd forgotten about these earlier frustrations as I was just trying to not sink under my coursework. It wasn't until 2016, more than a dozen years later, that this earlier frustration was excavated. At the time, there was a confluence of things going on in popular culture that seemed to happen all at once. In the picture, as you can see, there are kids who were used as the butt of a racial joke. That joke was told at the 2016 Academy Awards. They were trotted on stage as accountants for PricewaterhouseCoopers. And of course, these are just kids, so the joke is that by virtue of their Asianness, they would be good at math, and I guess accounting. There might also be the subtext that Asian kids are stripped of their childhood and used for labor, automatons from childhood. One of the kids' parents revealed later that they knew there'd be a joke, but the specific joke or how the kids would be used wasn't shared with the families. So there was little agency or participation in it. As you may remember, ironically, that was also the year of hashtag Oscars So White, and that irony catalyzed Asian American media workers who felt even more left out, erased, if you will. Around the same time, there were a number of high-profile casting decisions that seemed to place white actresses in Asian roles, progressive feminist inclusion that came at the expense of Asian Americans. I thought I'd share an example of one of the memes in Asian Twitter that mocks Scarlett Johansson, who's especially singled out for what users argue is repeated appropriation of not only Asian culture, but Asian identities. This isn't so new though, as Mari Yoshihara points out in her book, Embracing the East, White Women and Orientalism. White women have long claimed agency through the appropriation and domination of East Asian subjects. For reference, this is Blanche Bates. She gained wide acclaim for what was perceived as incredible range by playing a Japanese woman, Chow Chow-san, in Madame Butterfly. Yoshihara writes, it was not coincidental that the proliferation of white women's performances of Asian heroines and the emergence of new women overlapped. The freedom to cross racial, class, and cultural lines, even if it was temporary play, was part of being modern American women. In this racial landscape that hyperfeminizes Asian people and cultures, it's not surprising that playing Asian would be appealing for some white actresses. And it's not surprising that it's permissible and even celebrated as interesting creative choices. Even if it's not really creative at all, it fits cliched notions of gendered Asianness. Over the past years, we've seen these casting choices with Scarlett Johansson playing Major Kusanagi in Ghost in the Shell, and Tilda Swinton playing the Ancient One in Doctor Strange, and I'll talk about those representations more in a moment. But before I do, I wanted to point out that amidst all of this wide appropriation of Asianness and the seeming indifference of Hollywood, William Yu, a digital strategist, photoshopped John Cho onto movie posters in a hashtag called Starring John Cho. This sparked Asian American Twitter because it visualized our inclusion. It helped Asian Americans see what could be and what has been missing. Around that time, a lot was also being written about what was being called whitewashing. So let me share some of those headlines with you. The first is about Doctor Strange. Of the headlines I'm going to show, it was the only commercially successful movie, and this is arguably because the Ancient One is only a secondary character. It also didn't hurt that it was being boosted by being in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. After the criticism, the director Scott Derrickson explained that he wanted to avoid the cliche of an Asian mystic. He said he'd considered an Asian woman in this role, but he decided against it because he imagined it would be, quote, a straight-up dragon lady. And I'm not sure what he understands the dragon lady to be, but the Ancient One would not have been it. But anyway, with this reasoning in mind, he chose a Celtic monk who lived in Nepal. And while I appreciate that he tried, this was a huge disappointment. The Ancient One was still located in Asia. She was dressed in robes that evoked Tibetan Buddhist monks. That still associates mysticism with the East. It just changes the person in charge, replacing an Asian leader with a white one. If he really wanted to be transgressive, a more interesting choice would have been to make the Ancient One an Asian woman who learned Celtic magic and lives in Ireland. That reversal would have played with the stereotype in more interesting ways, still allowing Asian people to be magical and on screen, but dissociating them from Eastern mysticism and replacing it with Western mysticism instead. Matt Damon's casting in The Great Wall was also widely criticized. This is despite the fact that it was a Chinese-US production and that it was directed by the auteur, Zhang Yimou. Despite Zhang's high cinematic esteem, the movie relegated stars like Andy Lau, and if you don't know him from his impressive Hong Kong filmography, you may know him as the villain in Shang-Chi. He was relegated to a secondary role, and Matt Damon was placed as a central figure in stopping an ancient alien threat. He was also the romantic leading man. Importantly, the movie didn't swap out any Asian characters. What it did was center a white hero in Asia, and this too was understood by critics as whitewashing. As I'd been suggesting earlier, another film that was harshly criticized for whitewashing was Ghost in the Shell. And let me go ahead and answer that headline now. Does Hollywood have an Asian problem? Yes. And if you're wondering, that's a robot geisha from the movie. Sexualized and infantilized robot servants for wealthy men. It also hides the awesome Rila Fukushima, the actress who plays the robot. About Ghost in the Shell, Director Rupert Sanders and the author of the manga both said that Johansson's casting decision was fine with them because after all, the character is a cyborg. Cyborgs aren't born with a racial identity, so her shell doesn't really matter at all. But despite their claims, US fans didn't buy it. And I mean, literally they didn't buy it, as box office sales were considered disastrous, despite Scarlett Johansson's usually reliable draw. For Asian American fans, the reason for their disappointment is that the character of Major Kusanagi mattered a lot. The idea that this character, which has been pivotal in shaping Asian American self-identities, especially for Asian American women, would also be rendered white was too much to bear. The character was simply too iconic and too meaningful. The film made this even worse because it gave the Johansson character a specifically Japanese backstory, which I'll address later. Finally, Emma Stone was criticized for playing the role of Allison Ng in Aloha. Her character is meant to be mixed race, half white, a quarter Chinese, and a quarter Native Hawaiian. After the criticism, Emma Stone and the director Cameron Crowe both apologized. Crowe said he saw blonde, blue-eyed hapas, a Hawaiian term for mixed race people, all of the time. He failed to mention that many other hapas are not blonde and blue-eyed, and that this white representation of mixed race Asians has been a Hollywood staple for decades. For example, writing about Love is a Many Splendored Thing, a 1955 movie, Gina Marchetti notes that casting white women as mixed race Asians was a popular cinematic move. It avoided Hollywood prohibitions against mixed race romances on screen while telling, quote, exotic stories of forbidden love. It's important to note that of these movies, only Doctor Strange was successful. These criticized movies were all box office bombs. To give you some other examples outside of the films and the headlines I showed earlier, other movies with whitewashed representations of Asians and other people of color are Prince of Persia, The Last Airbender, Gods of Egypt, and The Lone Ranger. I point this out because oftentimes in Hollywood, people will say that green is the only color that Hollywood sees. All the problems of race are reduced to economic necessity. But if this were true, why would they keep making films with whitewashed casts? They're almost never successful. David Hesmondhall has written that the cultural industries are highly risk-averse because of the unpredictability of successes. Success is supposed to lead to similarity and imitation, and economic failure to avoidance. That's why we have so many remakes and reboots and investments in cinematic universes. That's the safest thing to do, after all. So what explains whitewashing then? If its track record is a box office failure, then who in their right mind would do it? So maybe it has to do with the whiteness at the top. As Nancy Wang Yuen has mentioned in her book, Real Inequality, Hollywood Actors and Racism, the C-suites in the entertainment industry have a higher percentage of white people than any industry in the US. I know this comes as a bit of a surprise to some people because we might think of Hollywood as more liberal than the rest of America. And in some ways it is, but in other important ways it isn't. So no conspiracy is needed, just a critical mass who have a shared ideological point of view. Indeed, with all of these movies, the reason for the failure has almost always been blamed on something else: rabid fans, bad casting, difficulty adapting anime into live action. Always something other than the most obvious conclusion, that a diversifying America doesn't want to see whitewashing. It kind of says something about the ideological investments in whiteness that failures are so easily put aside, but for films about people of color, one box office bomb produces anxieties that another won't be attempted again for years. Even successes are rarely copied, but seen as outliers instead, lucky one-offs. As the actor B.D. Wong has stated, the naming of whitewashing is useful because it provides new ammunition to attack an old practice, but yet whitewashing isn't really theorized. So I wondered if there's any scholarly value to doing so. And that's where this presentation turns to how I theorize whitewashing. And after I discuss my theoretical understanding of it, I'll go through a brief analysis of the live action remakes of Ghost in the Shell and Dragonball Evolution, and that'll be the basic organization of this talk. If we look back to the different films accused of whitewashing, it didn't seem to make sense to me at first. In some cases, the film stars played roles for Asians, but in other cases, they were written into the stories as white characters, but they were the center of an Asian story. Was there something that unified these different things? And after thinking about this for a while, the films accused of whitewashing seemed to fit a typology for me. And in the first are the movies that transform white people into Asians and Asian Americans. This is what Leilani Nishime has referred to as modern-day yellowface. That's the old practice of taping eyes and using prosthetics to produce an insulting image of how white people see Asians. Modern versions of it use digital technology instead. Think Jim Sturgis and Cloud Atlas. Or in the case of Aloha, they do away with the racist imagery, but still have white people play Asian without the prosthetics or CGI. Another case of what's called whitewashing is when white actors take Asian roles, but don't pretend to be Asian. In other words, the movie version of the ancient one isn't Asian, but the casting of Tilda Swinton means that an Asian character is replaced with a white one. And this can be true of stories too, like the movie 21. This is another Jim Sturgis-led film, by the way, where he's part of an MIT card counting scheme that cheats Vegas casinos. This story was based on a real-life group of Asian Americans led by Jeff Ma and his professor, John Chang. So both of these are really about replacement. The final one is a little different. These involve stories that have displaced Asian heroism with white heroism. These have also been considered whitewashed. That includes The Great Wall, The Last Samurai, and many martial arts movies set in Asia. Altogether, this is a somewhat wide-ranging list, so I wasn't sure how they all fit, especially the last group. Displacement seems different from replacement, but it still feels like whitewashing, at least to the movie's many critics. The inclusion of a white savior feels like an erasure too. And to clarify the audacity of this representation, let's imagine the reverse. Can you picture a movie in which a disenchanted Chinese soldier who's become a hardened vagrant, but still has a heart of gold, goes to colonial America, teaches George Washington how to lead his army, falls in love with Betsy Ross, plays the most important role in leading the Continental Army to victory against the British, and inspires the Constitution with his Eastern point of view. Yet as ridiculous as that sounds, although it may be interesting for some of us, that's what a lot of these movies of this type kind of do. And that's the audacity of whitewashing. So what is it that replacement and displacement have in common? After some reflection, I came to the conclusion that whitewashing is a strategic representational practice that animates and extends boundaries of whiteness by claiming greater ubiquity. That greater ubiquity comes at a cost though. And in the case of this presentation, it's Asian erasure. So how does this work? What's its ideological value? If we understand whiteness to be a discursive strategy of producing identity and meaning in opposition to people of color, as Richard Dyer points out, then whitewashing is a way of securing that. So in this sense, whitewashing isn't synonymous with whiteness. Whiteness, according to its theorists, wants to be invisible. It wants its power to be hidden. It also wants to be invisible because that lets whiteness defy definition. It lets whiteness be anything. It lets white people be defined as individuals rather than as marked by race. So what is whitewashing's role in whiteness? Well, I say that it's a representational practice because I think it's specifically mediated. I also think it has a purpose. Whiteness lets white people be anything. The Last Samurai, The Last Mohican, a Japanese cyborg, anything. It lets white people explore and play any culture, and indeed take over bodies, literalized in Ghost in the Shell. On the other hand, people of color are essentialized into limited and flattened possibilities. So the point of whitewashing is to make white people's anythingness more possible. It's to let whiteness be more things. It's to let whiteness continue to have the ability to, as Bell Hooks says, eat the other. So if this is the case, then how does it do it? Whitewashing seems pretty in your face. There's nothing subtle about it. In fact, that's probably the reason people don't study it. It seems so obvious. So what else needs to be said? But I'd argue that if we take Stuart Hall's notion of culture as an ideological terrain of struggle seriously, and we use that metaphor, then whitewashing is an invasion to gain ideological ground. It's an audacious offensive so that whiteness can be more, can have more. Extending this metaphor, the question is, how are the incursions successful? And I argue that it's because they have ideological covering fire. That is, it works paradoxically through its hypervisibility. It dares the viewer to not see it. And this reminds me of the children's book, The Emperor's New Clothes. People pretended not to see the ruler's lack of clothing because they were told that only sophisticated folks could see it, and no one wanted to admit their ignorance. Similarly, we're told that to point out the obvious racism of whitewashing is not sophisticated, that it's being too sensitive, that it's playing the race card. Not seeing racism is valorized as enlightened. This intentional lack of racial sight is called post-racialism or colorblind racism, And this is what obscures and makes whitewashing possible, at least in the times when it's successful. So I want to take a moment to try to understand how whitewashing fits with the related concepts like whiteness and white privilege, white supremacy. As I've charted here, white supremacy, or what I'm calling white racial hegemony, can take two primary paths. In the first, it's overt racism, in which whiteness is constructed explicitly as superior, morally, intellectually, physically, superior in the ways in which it sees itself as more civilized. This is a discourse that hasn't been relegated to the past, but has regrettably popped up more frequently in the public sphere. Or it can take the invisible form of whiteness, in which its power is hidden, in which whiteness takes on the paradoxical properties of seeming like nothing in particular, which allows it to be anything. One way that it can become anything is through the representational act of whitewashing, and the way whitewashing can succeed is because of the ideological cover of colorblindness. This ability to be anything, to be treated as an individual, is one form of white privilege. What Peggy McIntosh explains are the unearned advantages of having what's perceived to be a white racial identity. Privilege that's a product of white racial hegemony. So whitewashing contributes to the project of whiteness and the benefits of white privilege. And I just want to clarify that it's not the only way in which these are secured, but that it's one of an arsenal of ideological tools. So why Asian erasure in particular? In part, I think it's because of how we imagine East Asia as a place of adventure and exploration for white people, because of fetishized fantasies of pre-modern Asia and ironically postmodern cyberpunk. But it's also probably because white producers know there's less pushback. It's easier terrain to take. When Asian Americans protest for their own subjectivity and against white racism, Elaine Kim writes that many white people react with hostility. They're angry that Asian Americans aren't grateful for their proximity to white people and spaces, access that's provisionally granted in exchange for accepting the model minority and all of its baggage, its passivity, its subordination, its dehumanizing ways of viewing Asian people as soulless and so cyborg-like, and also its role in racial politics. This socializes many Asian Americans into internalizing silence because we've learned that speaking up and talking back comes with severe reprimand. So there's frequently an erasing of Asian American experience. There's a feeling of invisibility, but not the kind that hides power and privilege, but the kind that hides our humanity. The kind that says our stories are only worth telling through white faces and subjectivities. And that's certainly what we see in these movies. So thank you for letting me set up this argument about whitewashing before I move into the final part of the talk, the analysis of Dragonball Evolution and Ghost in the Shell. For context, both movies made it onto IndieWire's list of the top 25 worst examples of whitewashing in the movies. And at the time when I wrote my book, Dragonball Evolution was the 17th lowest rated movie on IMDb with 2.7 out of 10 stars. And I checked recently and it's down to 2.5, so I'm not sure where it ranks now. Let me also note quickly that Hollywood has long had interest in adapting and whitewashing anime. Just like the MCU, it has a built-in audience and rich worlds to draw out into a cinematic universe. But despite box office bombs like Speed Racer, Ghost in the Shell, Dragon Ball Evolution, there's been little interest in making the cinematic universe an Asian one. What's interesting about these adaptations is that unlike the MCU or DCU, producers can't argue canon. Source fidelity gets used as an argument to protect historically white representation, but this argument is easily cast aside for anime adaptations and Hollywood remakes of other Asian texts. By considering anime remakes, it allows us to see that concerns about canon are oftentimes just rhetorical justifications. They're not sincere. Instead, white racial hegemony has interests in protecting its representational terrain while also seeking to satisfy its ravenous appetite to consume, transform, and profit from difference. In the case of these films and many before it, the criticism was so intense that some of the film's writers, directors, and producers apologized for their whitewashing liberties. I felt especially bad for Ben Ramsey after reading his mea culpa, and you can see his quote here. And just to be fair to him, I don't think that when he was writing the script, he knew that the casting choice would be for a white actor. On the other hand, Ghost in the Shell producers tended to blame fans for the whitewashing controversy, which they didn't believe they deserved. After all, they said these are just shells, not real human bodies. And this is Neo Tokyo and not the real Tokyo. So I'm assuming that most of you haven't seen these movies, so I should probably start with a very quick description of their plots. In case, for those of you who are gluttons for punishment and plan on watching these after the talk is over, please note that there will be some major spoilers in the analysis, but I hope that it's okay since it's been several years since the movies have been released. Okay, so for Dragon Ball Evolution, Goku, who is played by Justin Chatwin, starts his hero's journey after his grandfather Gohan is killed and gives him the mission to find the Dragon Balls. Gohan is killed by Piccolo and Mai, his assassin. Gohan, by the way, is played by Randall Duck Kim. Piccolo is played by James Marsters, and Mai is played by Eriko Tamura. So with his dying breath, Gohan tells Goku to collect all the Dragon Balls to prevent Piccolo from destroying the Earth. And along the way, he's aided by several friends, including his love interest, Chi-Chi, played by Jamie Chung, and his grandfather's teacher, Roshi, played by Chow Yun-fat, and some others that I haven't included here. So they go to the American West to find the Dragon Balls and have their final showdown with Piccolo. Ghost in the Shell is set sometime in the future in Neo Tokyo. It's a futuristic city. Its visual aesthetics are classic cyberpunk, with images including giant holograms that are only minimally tethered to buildings. It's hyper-futuristic. But the streets are damp and gritty. At best, an homage to Blade Runner, at worst, a ripoff. And in this story, the cyborg Major Mira Killian, the film changed her name when they cast Johansson, works for Section 9, an anti-terrorist organization co-sponsored by the government and Hanka Robotics. Her direct boss is Aramaki, who is played by the legendary actor Beat Katano. Her partner, the man on the right with the cybernetic eyes, is Bateau. He's played by Pilu Asbek. At Hanka Robotics, the head of the Tokyo branch is Mr. Cutter, who's played by Peter Ferdinando. He's the one who's run the test to create a cyborg that merges a machine shell with a human body that's been wiped, or human brain that's been wiped of its memories. The terrorist they try to stop is Kuze. He's also a shell, but one that has been integrated into the network, what we might understand as the internet. And he's creating all kinds of mayhem and terrorism. Inexplicably, though, in Neo Tokyo, both Kuze and Major occupy white-appearing shells. And it's weird because you'd think in Neo Tokyo it'd be easier to blend in as a Japanese-appearing person. But anyway, let me show you a 5-minute clip where Kuze tells her the truth about who they are.
Tell me who you are.
I am that which you seek to destroy. In this life, my name is Kuze.
What are you doing to me?
I have connected you to a network of my own creation. When I am finished in this world, my ghost can survive there and regenerate.
What do you want from me?
I became fascinated with you. Reading your code while you were inside that geisha. Like nothing I had felt before, and yet so familiar. We are the same.
We are not the same. You kill innocent people.
Innocent, is that what you call them? I am as they made me.
Who made you?
What have they told you? That you were the first? The first cerebral salvage? You were born. Lessons took from my failure.
What are you talking about?
I was conscious while they dismembered my body and discarded me like garbage. I was lying on a table, listening to doctors talk about how my mind had not meshed with the shell that they had built. How Project 2571 had failed. and they had to move on. To you. What a beauty you are. They have improved us so much since they made me. They thought that we would be a part of their evolution, but they have created us to evolve alone. Beyond them.
Evolution, that's what you call it. Killing everyone who made you.
You're not listening to me.
You're a murderer.
They tried to kill me first. It is self-defense. Defense of self. More will die until they tell me what they took.
I won't let that happen.
You want to kill me? Like everyone else. Do it then. Do what you were programmed to do.
What is that? What is that?
I can't remember, but I am haunted by it. Do you see it? Don't take the medication that they give you. They use it to suppress your memories. Your shell belongs to them, but not your ghost. Your ghost is yours. Remember that, and maybe you can remember it all.
So this interaction leads to an existential crisis. Has to start my video, right? So this leads to an existential crisis. Eventually, she learns that she used to be Motoko Kusanagi, played by Kaori Yamamoto. She learns she was kidnapped by Honka Robotics along with her friends who were hiding out in the lawless zone. Honka Robotics experimented on young people who sought a life outside of the new technological age that they lived in. Learning this, Major turns against Honka Robotics, revealing Mr. Cutter to be the real villain of the story, but she doesn't join Kutse. Unlike him, she's not bitter about being lied to, and she doesn't struggle with being Japanese in a white woman's robotic shell. So despite the two movies' differences in location and time, they have some striking similarities which will drive the analysis. First, I'm going to discuss how both of these movies share a similar narrative structure, the hero's journey of self-discovery to affirm their white selves. And then I'll talk about how the movies both rely on the white savior trope. And finally, I'll talk about representations of good Asians that provide ideological cover. In some forms of post-racist media, race is implied to not matter because race is supposedly very incidental to the characters' relationships and lives. Like the metaphor in both movies, race and physical bodies are just shells. That these shells overrepresent white bodies seem to be beside the point. Their hypervisibility is rendered unimportant because of the prevailing logic of color blindness that silences race talk. This is the irony of post-racism. We're told race doesn't matter, but then in casting and story choices, race oftentimes does. And in this scene, we'll learn a little bit about who Goku is when he confronts Piccolo, the villain of the story. This clip is about 1.5 minutes long.
Goku's time is over. Goku is a shell. This is who you are. You traveled by meteor to hide amongst the vermin until your 18th birthday. This is where you landed, and where you will be reborn. You serve me.
Goku, no!
I don't think Goku's there anymore.
Ozaru, they have a Dragon Ball. Bring it to me.
All right, so by the end of the movie, Goku comes back to his senses after remembering the words of his grandfather to always have faith in who you are. He chooses his white humanity represented by a shell rather than becoming the powerful Osaru, the destroyer of worlds. Instead, he's able to incorporate Osaru's power while maintaining his humanity. That gives him the ability to defeat Piccolo. It's through his white body that he can possess different selves, culturally Chinese American, visibly white, and physically alien. So here the connections to Ghost in the Shell are uncanny. The heroes both choose their white shells rather than their actual identities, and that's more than ideological coincidence. Oops. In Ghost in the Shell, the anime explored an existential question of what humanity is in a future age of advanced robotics. But the film remake is layered with racial meanings because of Johansson's visible presentation as a white woman. This is because Major learns in her journey of self-discovery that she was a Japanese woman with a Japanese mother. Her question of whether she should embrace her shell or her former self has obvious racial subtext. In the end, her identity crisis is resolved when she embraces her new purpose and by extension, her white shell. This conclusion to search for her humanity doesn't make much narrative sense, because why would she go to all this trouble just to ultimately not care? That said, despite its narrative nonsense, it makes racial sense, because to be Japanese is to be less human, to be the cyborg, even if in this narrative, being Japanese is to be human. Her backstory as a Japanese woman is a way to claim difference to create a more interesting self. It enriches white Americans' beliefs about their own identities, but in a way that doesn't have the burdens and oppression of visible racial difference. As Hamamoto writes, Asiaphilia is a deceptively benign ideological construct that naturalizes and justifies the systematic appropriation of cultural property and expressive forms created by, and he's using the word provocatively here, yellow people. The whiteness of Asiaphilia in these remakes dislocates Asian heroic figures in favor of white ones that conquer dangerous Asian foes. Both Major and Goku act as white savior figures in their own frontiers, the cyberpunk future of Ghost in the Shell and the US American desert in Dragonball Evolution. As white savior figures, they resonate with the frontier hero in the Western. According to Fitzgerald, the Western is a uniquely American morality tale in which the white hero demonstrates benevolent supremacy. As Murphy and Harris point out, the Western frontier myth and the white savior have many overlaps. In these films, instead of saving a single town, Major and Goku save all of humanity. Goku fights a millennia-old alien power, and Major fights a cyborg-like terrorist. Although there's some semiotic openness in the films, let me make the case that Kusei and Piccolo are Yellow Peril villains. In Ghost in the Shell, the terrorist mastermind is Kusei, who was Japanese, but now inhabits computer networks, except when he's embodied in a white shell. Unlike Major, he doesn't embrace his white shell and role in human society. Instead, he endangers mankind by becoming a techno-orientalist threat that mostly lives within cybernetic systems. In this way, whiteness is connected to humanity, despite it being the shell for Major, and his Japaneseness is not only associated with his past, but it's associated with robotic threat, his ghost that lives within cybernetic systems. Kusei's rejection then isn't just of humanity, but of whiteness, and his soulless technological revenge is coded as Asian. Piccolo, on the other hand, isn't even human. Even still, he can be easily read as Asian. As Polk writes, a common representation of Asians is as aliens and as androids. So with Piccolo's use of magical mystical arts and his plan to destroy the Earth, he evokes Asian villain figures like Fu Manchu and Marvel's Mandarin. The connection is more explicit with their visibly Asian subordinates. There's the dragon lady-like figure Mai, who helps Piccolo. She doesn't use her sexuality in ways that are dangerous to the white hero, but she's highly sexualized in her skin-tight burgundy-colored bodysuit. And in Ghost in the Shell, there are perverse Asian men and hordes of gangsters. These images connect to common notions of the yellow peril that are meant to show the white hero's extraordinary ability and heroism. The representation of hordes is already dehumanizing and belittling, but their cyborg-like makes that dehumanization more literal. It's perhaps more fully realized in the robot geishas that signify the dialectic between the hypersexualized passive woman and the hypersexualized threat. So let me show you what I mean here. Here's a clip that shows the cyberpunk cityscape and the Japanese as a yellow peril threat. And this one is about 5 minutes in length.
All patrolling area units be advised. Possible cybercrime activity in the vicinity. Airspace and all controlled areas to be locked in. Section 9 is currently on site. Repeat. All patrolling area units be advised. Possible cybercrime activity.
This is Major. I'm on site.
I'm human. I'm flawed. But I embrace change. And enhancement? Now there's nothing I can't do. Nothing I can't know. Nothing I can't be. Wait, listen to something.
Au clair de la lune, mon ami Pierrot.
It's my 4-year-old daughter. The time it took her to sing that lullaby, she learned to speak fluent French. No,
There's an echo box up here. Someone's scanning data traffic. Let's see who's worth this kind of surveillance. Accessing hotel security network. Got it. 43rd floor. Someone contact the president's staff. Someone's watching him.
Dr. Osmond, what is it you want from us?
I think it's more about what Hanker Robotics can do for you. 73% of this world is woken up to the age of cyber enhancement. You really want to be left behind.
My people embrace cyber enhancement, as do I. There's no one who really understands the risk to individuality, identity, messing with the human soul.
Gentlemen, excuse me, I think you have the wrong...
Hallway, 6 men, shots fired. Section 9 ETA.
2 minutes out, Major.
Too long. I'm going in.
I've heard this speech before from your competitors. And now, Hanker Robotics serves it with milky sake.
Hey.
This is what I'm talking about.
sent you. Please. Answer me.
Collaborate with Henko Robotics and be destroyed.
So the other Asian villain in Ghost in the Shell, excuse me, is Mr. Cutter, who cannot reasonably be read as Asian, but instead he represents the threat of masculinist technology and the moral abandonment of humanity for capitalist greed. But although he's not read as Asian, it's possible to read the film as suggesting that his adjacency to Asianness is why he abandoned his humanity, and in this way, like Kusei, he abandons his whiteness. According to Tierney, Asians are distinguished in film as good or bad by whether they support or oppose the white hero's entitlement to Asian cultural practices. By supporting them, they provide ideological cover to what would otherwise read as even more obviously racist stories of white heroes' cultural plundering and their biological and moral superiority. In Dragonball Evolution, Gohan complicates usual representations of Asian American patriarchs in contemporary US culture. He shows deep abiding love for Goku, even though he likely knew that his adopted grandson was really Osaru. This picture of a loving Asian patriarch is pretty uncommon. Think of the erasure of Asian dads in All of the Boys I've Loved Before and the televisual run of Gilmore Girls. Indeed, in this Ghost in the Shell adaptation, a loving Asian patriarch has a bit of counter-representational potential that may have been possible because the film was directed by James Wong. In the story, however, Gohan dies fairly early and is replaced by Roshi, who was Gohan's former master. For both of them, their main purpose is to pass their knowledge on to the white hero, a common trope of US martial arts movies. Unlike Goku's grandfather, Roshi is a drunk and a pervert. As Marchetti notes, representations of Asian men as sexually perverse is cinematically quite common. This notion of Asian men's sexual perversion is highlighted even more severely in a bar scene in Ghost in the Shell. But back to Dragon Ball. The other Asian ally is Goku's love interest, Chi-Chi. Her role is primarily decorative in order to affirm Goku's heterosexuality. In the movie, she's not weak, but her agency is limited to helping Goku's character develop. In contrast, Major has no Asian male love interest to affirm her heterosexual feminine virility. The only significant Japanese character is Aramaki, her boss. Notably, Beat Takashi was added shortly after the casting controversy with Scarlett Johansson. Otherwise, there might not have been any significant Japanese representation at all. Despite being a flatly drawn character, he has moments of heroic action that evoke the Western gunslinger. He's represented as a cool character, but he has little purpose other than supporting Major. And this is true for her mother as well. In the entire movie, in fact, despite being in Neo-Tokyo, there's not a single Japanese woman that exercises any agency. One of the film's producers, Stephen Paul, justified the whitewashing by claiming that the erasure of Japanese people in Tokyo demonstrated that Neo-Tokyo is, quote, an international world. Thus, he used globalized multiculturalism as an excuse to replace Japanese people while holding on to the visual aesthetic of Japaneseness for the city. And this is about as good a metaphor as any for the narrative erasure of Asianness. Following William Yu's example with the starring John Cho photoshopped movie posters, I thought I'd reimagine what these films would be like with simple casting differences. Even if the stories remained the same, would different bodies matter? And for this, I imagined Rila Fukushima in the role. This would recover her from the dehumanizing, demeaning role of playing the robot geisha we saw earlier. Here's an image from her playing a major role in the 2013 movie, The Wolverine, which is also a part of the MCU. When the white-appearing terrorist Kusei and the white corporate villain Mr. Cutter are opposed by a Japanese woman in a Japanese-appearing shell alongside Aramaki, then the movie reads differently. It subverts who the villain is and who the hero is, and it positions the story as a decolonial one. Since Neo-Tokyo is run by white people in most positions of on-screen power, then Neo-Tokyo reads as a colonized space. Opposition to Mr. Cutter wouldn't just be opposition to an unchecked corporate madman, but a challenge to white Western takeover. Further, in a Japanese shell, Major's identity search would make more sense. At the end of the film, Major visits the grave of her former body, Motoko Kunagi. With Rila Fukushima in the role, instead of a metaphorical burial of her former self to embrace her future in her white shell, It'd be easier to make a negotiated reading in which Major incorporates the ghost in the shell into a unified self. For Dragonball Evolution, I picture Keong Lee in the role because honestly, I don't know any young 20-something Asian American actors. They don't seem to get visibility that early in their careers. Young Asian men don't get a career boost as potential heartthrobs in a media industry that emasculates Asianness. So for this, I'll go with Keong Lee. He was in the Maze Runner movies, so maybe he could pass as an 18-year-old despite being in his mid-30s now. Off the bat, the film would make more narrative sense as Goku never questions his film heritage in the movie when he's white and his grandfather is Chinese. And really, that doesn't seem to make much sense that he would never wonder. So in the original casting, it could have been transgressive to have a Chinese man adopt a white baby, but this is never productively confronted in the text. As an Asian American man, Goku's positioning as the hero would also have counter-hegemonic potential. First, he'd be coupled with an Asian woman, a romantic pairing rarely depicted on screen, especially before Crazy Rich Asians and the recent Ali Wong vehicles. And we should also kind of keep in mind that Ali Wong was an Asian American studies major, so her choices do seem intentional. With the power that she'd earned after her Netflix comedy specials became huge hits, she appears to have leveraged that into opportunities for Asian American men co-leads. In Dragon Ball Evolution, importantly, having an Asian American Goku would challenge the typical underdog story. I can't recall a single studio film about an Asian American hero, except maybe Big Hero 6, who's overlooked and picked on, who rises up to embark on the hero's journey. But even if there is an example or two, the exception proves the rule, because according to Wang, Asian Americans are the most frequently bullied in the US. So having an Asian American underdog would resonate with Asian Americans who might imagine growing up and saving the world. That'd be a heroic turn, especially because he'd be fighting for a world that has produced his racialized rejection. It'd be better if there were more substantive narrative changes too, but even with just these casting choices, that would be a start in changing the meanings of these texts. So whitewashing in anime adaptations reserves superherodom for white people. When even animes are changed to feature white heroes, then it means herodom is the near exclusive domain of white characters. This may be one of the reasons that whitewashed anime adaptations viscerally feel so damaging. Hopefully, seeing Asian American protagonists will allow a reimagination of our humanity and our value in this country, something that's needed now more than ever in a continuing environment of anti-Asian racism. Thank you.
Oh, wow. This has been great. I'm very excited to get into the question and answer period of this. As you can see, there are several people applauding you, but I'm going to dive right in. And for the point of just keeping things rolling, I'll just call you David. You call me Keenan.
Yeah, sure.
Right. We got some great questions for you, but before we get into them, can you do us a service of defining and redefining for the participants whitewashing and then whiteness? I noticed that several of the questions center on those two terms, so I want to make sure everyone is on the same page.
Yeah, so can I make this a pithy kind of definition? I'm not sure. I'll just start talking and hopefully things will work out. So when we think about whiteness, we think of it as a strategy of domination and I guess we could even say like a liberal strategy of domination in which white power becomes invisible. Okay. But the way in which white power and the function of hiding power allows that power to remain unchecked and unquestioned, which also produces the opportunity for white people to not be defined as anything in particular. If this helps at all for people who are viewing, one exercise that I like to do with some of my classes is to say, if you think about, just so that we can start thinking about whiteness a little bit, tell me a stereotype of white people that is not about a specific nationality, not about a specific subgroup, not about a specific region of the world, not about Americans. What is that stereotype? But we do have stereotypes, and I know that sometimes people will pull out one or two, but it's very difficult to do. But it's very easy for us to think of stereotypes for all Asian people, all Black people, all Latinx people around the entire world. And that demonstrates, I hope, the ways in which whiteness is a strategy of maintaining power through its invisibility.
Got it. So,
Whitewashing, oh,
no,
sorry.
go ahead.
Whitewashing, on the other hand, then becomes this very overt representational practice that secures, or that attempts to secure, greater representational possibilities for whiteness. So although scholars do say that whiteness has the kind of the paradoxical qualities of being anything and nothing at the same time, I would kind of argue that this isn't exactly true. Whiteness can't be everything. There are some things that we still reserve as particular to like Asian Americans or Chinese Americans or Japanese Americans. And those things are contested. Like when the Boston Museum had white women dress up in kimonos, for example. However, the point that I'm trying to make is that whitewashing tries to reclaim that territory again, or to claim territory that it currently doesn't possess. And it does this through these not small little representational moves, but rather these audacious representational moves to try to claim territory without being criticized. And if it can get away with not being criticized, then that means that it can gain more representational ideological territory.
Got it. So it seems like whiteness places what is white as a privileged set, because all of this seems to fall in the category of hegemony. I know you definitely mentioned that, but the hierarchical placing of various nationalities or positions of power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right. Well, diving into some other questions now that we've got a pretty good understanding of that. Someone got started by saying they're a great fan of your work, and I think this question leads into that. They say they were thinking of your earlier comment on how whitewashing allows whiteness to flourish, to do and be anything, and reassert its subjectivity. This reminds me of your conceptual framework of the vast terrain of whiteness sprawling between Black and yellow faces. Now, here's the question. Does Hollywood whitewashing work, in your opinion, to expand this vast territory or terrain of possibility for white viewers to the detriment of further pushing Asian viewers to the margins up against the fence?
Yeah, definitely. So I think this is in reference to the work that I did on the Rush Hour movies. But the argument that I make in that article is that whiteness gets positioned between two poles, so that if we think about the ways in which people talk about whiteness, they talk about it as a referential identity. Sometimes people call it an oppositional identity, meaning that it is created in opposition to something else. So it doesn't define itself as anything. It says that whiteness is not this. Whiteness is not Asianness. Whiteness is not Blackness. So the argument that I try to make in that article is that in US racial politics, that Blackness and Asianness are positioned as two binary poles, and whiteness is centered in the middle. And so in that case, if the question is, if whitewashing succeeds and takes more representational territory, then yes, I think that we would understand that as meaning that Asianness becomes smaller and more narrow and pushed further into the margins. One of the things that I also tell my students as well is that, we could wish away stereotypes, but stereotypes have an important ideological function for whiteness, because if whiteness has to be defined by what it's not, it has to clearly define what the other is, and stereotypes function to do that. If whitewashing takes more terrain away, then that means that what Asianness is allowed to be becomes a narrower and narrower band of possibilities that are more dehumanizing.
Got it. All right. That definitely answers the question. My opinion. I'm going to shift to something focused on a remake. Definitely want to get started with Cowboy Bebop because I love the intro. It's fantastic. But what are your thoughts on the Cowboy Bebop live action adaptation? And more specifically, do you think that the adaptation and similarly the upcoming One Piece live adaptation, I can't wait to watch everybody do the run, was heading in a better direction for proper and ethical Asian representation?
I do. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know if you wanted a fuller answer than that, but I certainly think that it was an attempt to try. And I have to credit, I suppose, the producers for being willing to make that choice, but also Asian American media workers and fans who have been active in opposing this kind of whitewashing. And I think that that opposition will be necessary, because that's the only way in which we reveal that the emperor does in fact have no clothes. And so I think that it was an important step. I'm just sad that it wasn't executed more effectively and that people didn't like it more. But I think that's also a burden that unfortunately Asian American media workers and artists have to carry. Sometimes they call that rep sweats. The burden and expectation, the anxiety of getting it right and being successful for fear of making it impossible for future people to be able to do similar things. But I think it was a step in the right direction. I'm not familiar enough with the One Piece remake to comment on it, unfortunately.
No worries on that one. I'm going to stick with, I guess, Netflix for right now. But in spite of the recent controversy regarding one of the actors, what is your take on the Netflix series Beef? It has an all-Asian, or at least majority cast. This shows many aspects of Asian American life. Would you say it falls in line with moving towards the right direction?
Yeah, so this is so hard, because I don't know. Can I hold two feelings at the same time?
Absolutely. If I can, we like dual consciousness.
If I can hold two feelings at the same time, I am so disappointed that they decided to cast, and I'm forgetting his name, but I'm disappointed that they made that particular casting choice, not only because of how that elevates him as a figure in popular culture, but also because it diminishes the series. That there are people now who are unwilling to watch the series because of his role in it. There are people who now criticize the series in ways that could have been avoided if he wasn't in it. And so there's a part of me that feels really affirmed by Beef. It shows representation, and I alluded to Ali Wong doing really good work. I think not only this, but also with her previous rom-com on Netflix, Always Be My Baby. And I think she makes really smart and intentional choices that are important for humanizing Asian American representation in ways that aren't necessarily just positive. And I know that people always ask for positive representation, but I think what we really mean is what we want more complex, humanizing representation, fuller representation, right? We want to play bad guys too. That's not positive, but it can be a very interesting choice, and it can be a humanizing choice. So I believe that that series did that really well, and it showed aspects of Asian American life, and for me as a Korean American life, like the church, that feels really familiar, and that feels genuine. And so I'm affirmed in many ways by the television series Beef, and I think it does really good work, but I'm also very disappointed at that casting choice. Gotcha. And so anyway.
All right. Well,
yeah, kind of ambivalent, right?
No. I think that's an honest, critique. I think it comes back to your point of there is you can make 400 different Robin Hood movies. It doesn't seem to be a problem, because if one is horrible, they're still going to make 6 more. I remember a time there were 2 Robin Hood movies in the theater at the same time. So, but when it comes to something like this, when it comes to representation, you got to get it right, or they're not going to do it again. So I appreciate that. I understand the dual consciousness on it.
Right. And even when they do get it right, they don't actually ever do it again, or they don't do it again very often, right? Like if I think about something like Black Panther, when have we had another major tentpole film that features a predominantly Black cast? After Crazy Rich Asians, when have we had another major film, studio film with an Asian American cast? It's funny how succeeding doesn't seem to lead very quickly to payoffs in an industry that's known for imitation and imitation as a way of trying to replicate success, but failure leads to harsh consequences, right? And so anyway.
No, I definitely, I appreciate the last statement. It kind of speaks more to the way systems of oppression continuously stay in power. They change the playing field and the rules depending on who's at bat. But got a question that lines up with your discussion of villains, and was kind of interested when I saw this question come down the pike. What are your thoughts on the recent Hollywood trends of shifting character tropes of the Asian American female characters as the new mean girls or the love interest, but still having white love interest or Asian American male characters who are the popular guy or the dumb jocks?
Yeah, you know, so I recognize that there are limitations in terms of what we're going to be able to create in this media system. So unless we subvert the entire media system, then we have to work within its commercial logics. And so one of the things that I always tell my students who may go on to something is, you know, so we understand in class that representational structures are these patterns of representation that we see over and over again. And so the one thing that I'm going to ask of you, I know that you can't like make a film that's going to be completely, perfectly counter-hegemonic. That doesn't exist. But rather to make one choice that's different, one choice that's new, one choice that moves away from the pattern. So I am not going to say that if we have an Asian American woman character with a white male, you know, romantic lead, that yes, that fits with typical patterns of representation. But if the character does something that's different, I'm of two minds. On the one hand, as a critic, I still might criticize it. But on the other hand, I would say I'm glad that they've made that choice. I'm glad they've made a different choice and have tried something different because I know how hard that is. And so I wouldn't say, you know, from now on into the future, there should never be like an Asian woman, white male pairing in a film. But what I want to see is, can we make that choice differently? Can we choose to have like an Asian woman with a Latino male lead? Can we have an Asian woman with a Black male co-lead? Can we have an Asian woman with an Arab American co-lead? Can we do something different? It's not that itself is like unjustifiable. It's that it fits within a particular pattern of representation that reifies structures rather than challenges it. So the more that we can challenge it, the better. But again, I say this understanding, of course, the limitations of an industry that not only has capitalist logics, but that also operates under white racial logics as well. And so I know it's not always possible, but what I hope for is that people try.
Okay.
And that people at least try to make one change that's different.
I like the yeah, no, I like the one change that is different thing. I definitely want to come back to that as a discussion point, but I guess a follow-up to some of the things that we were discussing, especially with the whole patterns thing and one change that's different, and kind of I'll own the words a liberal policy of going into making changes rather than a radical one. Do you think Hollywood is going safe by using mixed white Asian actors as romantic leads so that the character movie is more palatable for its viewers?
Oh gosh, this is fraught terrain here that you're putting me into, Keenan. But I guess there's a lot of work by scholars who identify as critical mixed race scholars. And I think that they would make that argument. So I feel less confident making that argument because I know how problematic it can be. But I would say that critical mixed race studies, people who study Asian Americans, have pointed out that yes, this is a way in which we can represent exoticness in ways that feels safer to white audiences. But I want to be careful about saying that as well, because I also recognize that for mixed race Asian Americans, they may also feel like they're left out of Asian America. They're delegitimated. And so I don't mean to say that this is, that it is necessarily problematic, but what I would prefer to see is if shows, instead of presenting a mixed race Asian American character as simply Asian American, would own the fact that they're a mixed race person.
Yeah.
And to complicate the story by leaning into the actor's mixed race identity so that representations of race could be more complicated, instead of playing a game in which we end up, I guess, competing against one another, and being pitted against one another in a move toward racial equality and liberation. And so how can we think about that without accidentally falling into the traps that white racial hegemony is setting up if we make those criticisms? And so I think I would instead say, I would love to see a continued inclusion of mixed race actors in Hollywood. I just want more stories that actually lean into the fact that they're mixed race and legitimates mixed race identities in the United States.
Okay, no, I could definitely see where you're going with that, because the question kind of put in mind Kung Fu back when God, was that still on TV when I was a kid? I don't want to date myself too much, but with David Carradine over Bruce Lee and the total changing of that character to make it very palatable for audiences, and the shifting that is happening to, okay, now there's at least a mixed race, but we don't talk about it. I like the idea of at least complicating the storyline and addressing those issues as you see them. It kind of goes along with this next question that was presented, where someone said, do you think there's an element of prioritizing whiteness, so to speak, in some anime that supports Hollywood's whitewashing and live adaptations? And for example, they're giving Goku and Vegeta, I mean, all of the Saiyans, if you want to get into it, turning it to blue-haired, blue-eyed figures when they reach Super Saiyan. I don't know if they're talking about Brody here, but we'll leave that alone. Similarly, Ratu or Sailor Moon, blonde hair, blue-eyed leads. I mean, I wonder if there are connections there.
So I think the answer to that question for me isn't necessarily that they're doing this in order for it to be more likely that it will be adaptable in the United States, but rather it's because of, at least in my view, what Koichi Uebuchi refers to as mukukozeki, which is cultural odorlessness. His belief that the strategy of Japanese media producers has been to create texts that are read as like culturally neutral, or at least culturally as neutral as possible, so that when people are receiving the text abroad, then they would be more likely to accept it and to watch it. Other scholars, I believe it was Fabian Darling-Wolf, who had pointed out that I think that when Japanese producers actually want to make someone specifically white, they will do that in very obvious ways. And so it is kind of a conceit of Western viewers to read the characters as white characters because of the ways in which we interpret particular signifiers. So for example, in anime, eyes are often drawn very large because within East Asian cultures, at least, and you can see this with like emoji work, that in East Asian culture, emotions are often thought to be represented through the eyes. Whereas if you look at Western emojis, it's often with the mouth, right? The mouth becomes the major signifier of emotion. So that in anime, the eyes are big because it makes it easier to visualize the emotion of the character. But that gets read in the West as a Western character, right? So I don't think that Japanese producers are doing this in order for it to be adapted. I think they're doing this as kind of a visual style that makes Japanese-ness less of an obstacle for viewers around the world who would want to watch it.
Got it. So in this, we're kind of getting at the Eurocentric, or at least Western-centric meaning making that this is something that you're putting in, you're bringing in, and you're applying your own rules and regulations around race to this. Okay, got it. And it's a great point, because when you said that in anime, if the animators want to show that a character is white or black in sometimes problematic cases, it is definitely visible. So okay, definitely hear you on that. I guess another question, going back to Sailor Moon and Inuyasha, this person said they've always read characters as presenting in some ways as both white and Japanese, or confusing either by way of them being drawn. How does whitewashing work in cartoons or anime that are drawn or perhaps produced by non-white creators? I guess this is a follow-up to some of the things you were saying.
Can you tell me the last part of that question again, Keenan?
Sure. How does whitewashing work in cartoons or anime that are drawn or perhaps produced by non-white creators?
By non-white creators, I'm assuming this means specifically to Japanese creators?
I think so. I think the question is also getting into that the producers of a art form may be acting within one set of social norms, and the audience may be receiving in another. Do you feel that non-white creators are producing work in a specific way for a specific reason?
Yeah, I think I'll just answer this in terms of Japanese producers, so that I can have a little more specificity in terms of how I'm thinking about my answer. But I think my answer would be that it's possible that, like Iwabuchi is saying, that they are producing it intentionally in a way that makes its ethnic specificity less visible. I also think that when they're creating it, that for Japanese producers of manga and anime, that they're primarily thinking of the Japanese market as the market in which they're creating these texts. And so for them, what I would understand this to be is that they're creating these anime in a visual style and language that makes sense for Japanese viewers. To the extent that that gets read differently in the United States or in other places in the world, has to do with not, at least in my view, not as much about what they're trying to intend in the text in terms of race and ethnicity, but rather in terms of the racial worldviews that we use when we interpret a text. And so is there ambiguity there? Perhaps from our perspective, but maybe not so much from a Japanese perspective.
Okay. Coming back to the conversation on audiences and the effect of media or mediums like movies and anime, manga on those audiences. In movies like Memoirs of a Geisha, Asian characters play characters of different Asian ethnicities than their own. Do you see these casting choices as detrimental to Asian representation as well?
That's also a really difficult question too. For Memoirs of a Geisha, so I think I want to answer it a little bit differently if I can.
Okay.
So I'm going to answer it not so much as is it detrimental, but rather what would be preferable. Okay. From my perspective, I would prefer to have Japanese actresses play those roles. Here's the reason. I know this is going to be controversial, particularly as we think about the limited roles for Asian actors and actresses in Hollywood and that kind of work. The reason that I think it would be preferable is because there are subtle differences in language, in visual appearance, in cultural practice, that when we use other Asian actresses in those roles, they don't necessarily represent us fully. And so to that extent, it can kind of racialize East Asians as all being similar in the US imagination, and to have the possibility for us to understand that there's more complexity, in my view, would be a better choice. So here's another part of that argument that that I also think about as well. And I think it would be different if this was about Asian Americans rather than about Japanese women in Japan in particular. Another reason is that this kind of, because they chose actors who were not even Asian American, but were Chinese actresses, it also kind of was interpreted in Japan as a backhanded representational choice to say that there were no good Japanese actresses who would fit the role, particularly as producers had argued that they scoured the country looking for appropriate Japanese actresses, but they just couldn't find them. And so I think that that's problematic in the ways in which it also insults Japanese actresses in the nation of Japan.
Okay. And that really takes my mind to many, many different places. But it seems like a lot of the points around this are, we sometimes just consider the audience of who is receiving or viewing these shows, these movies, this anime, manga, and we don't necessarily think of where it was created or who was necessarily created for. I think that's a really interesting point. And your last point, talking about the rarity of roles that sometimes comes up. I've heard the criticism often in the Black community that there seems to be more and more British-born Black folk playing roles within the United States. And is that a backhanded slap to many of the Black actors, or at least African-American from the United States, that there was no one there to get into it? And I think it really comes back to something you were saying of the pitting against each other. I was wondering if you could talk about that for a bit, and then I'm going to ask you about Avatar: Last Airbender.
Oh gosh, wow. So I certainly would agree with you in terms of the ways in which it pits people of color, in this case within our own communities, against one another, right? Not to mention how white racial hegemony pits people of color against one another across racial difference. So yes, I certainly think that that's the case, but if I can kind of switch the perspective a little bit, okay, so this is going to just be a little bit provocative, but I'll just go ahead and say it. I also am a little frustrated, not with the specific choice of Black British actors, but with the sudden increase over the past decade of British actors into Hollywood. And part of the reason that bothers me is that it seems like as we become a more diverse country, that there are some parts of this nation that wants to look even further to Great Britain, to UK as a place of origin. And that seems to be a way, at least in my view, of trying to resist the diversification of the United States by hearkening to an Anglo heritage. The inclusion of more British actors, including Black British actors, seems to go to this idea that by being British, that makes them better. And this, I think, is the larger problem, not the specific casting choice of, let's say, like Daniel Kaluuya in Get Out, but rather of the ways in which the industry, it imagines the UK as being a better place, as having more sophisticated actors. I think that's problematic because of the ways in which it seems to want to valorize our former colonizer instead of valorizing the people here in this nation.
Wow. That, I definitely accept that point. We've got about a minute left for question. I'll give you an opportunity to tell us where we're going. And I use Last Airbender as a place of department where we're leaving, and we're looking at things like Everywhere, Everything, All at Once, Crazy Rich Asians.
Yeah.
It seems like we're turning a corner. Would you agree? And if so, can you tell us why in about a minute?
Okay. So this book came out before all of that stuff happened. I was starting to write it with Crazy Rich Asians was being released in theaters. And at that time, I wasn't sure, because it seems like every 20 years something comes along, Flower Drum Song, and then why do I always forget the title of that movie in the 80s? But anyway, you all know what I'm referring to, hopefully. But it seems like there's always something every 20 years in which there is some Asian American representation. But I think now, maybe, hopefully, there is some improvement. And I would like to believe that improvement is happening because with the 1965 Immigration Act and people coming into this country, now second generation Asian Americans are coming of age, and they're Joy Luck Club, yes, thank you, are coming of age, and they're entering into the media industries. That I hope that that means that there is more space for our stories to be told. I think that also unintentionally, platforms like Netflix have had to look abroad as studios have pulled their production from the distributor, so that now Netflix and other streaming services have been looking at countries and in places that allow for Asian American stories to be told in ways that the traditional industry had not given access to before. But anyway, I know that that's going along, so I should probably end it there.
No, it was perfect, and I think we ended well. Thank you very much, David. To everyone in our audience, please complete the post survey, the first event survey at the end of this discussion, and continue the conversation online at #NCID anti-racism, and follow us on Twitter at UMISHNCID. Thank you very much to the production team and everyone for joining us. David, this has been fantastic. Everyone else, until then, have a great day.